Okay. Webinar started. Welcome to those who are joining right now. Welcome to Venezuela-US Relations under Trump 2.0. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're going to give a few minutes for folks to join the webinar. Thank you for being here tonight. And as you're getting on, if you'd like to introduce yourselves in the chat, you're welcome to do that. Say who you are and where you're calling in from, and if you're part of an organization. Oh, I understand the chat might be off. Let's see. So welcome to those who are joining to the Venezuela-US Relations under Trump 2.0 webinar. We'll get started in just a moment. The chat is open now. So welcome Coral from Sydney, Australia, and Eulalia. You're welcome to introduce yourself. And we'll just give it another minute so that folks can find the link and get on. Okay, welcome everyone to the Venezuela-US Relations under Trump 2.0 webinar. We're excited to have you here this evening. My name is Margaret Flowers and I will be your moderator tonight. Before we get started, we do have interpretation tonight. Thank you to Giselle and Jose for doing that. If you need interpretation, Spanish to English or English to Spanish, if you look at the bottom bar of your Zoom interface, you'll see a globe and you can click on that. That's the interpretation. And then from there, you can choose which language you need interpretation on. And so I'll ask Leo if he can explain that, please, in Spanish.
Sure. So, para activar la interpretación simultánea, busque por favor el icono del globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom. Quizás esté bajo donde dice More o Más. Y seleccione su idioma preferido. También está la opción para silenciar el audio original, que desactivará la sobreposición de voces para un sonido más claro.
Great, thank you so much. So this webinar is being co-hosted by the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which is a new North American-based network of organizations and individuals who are working to defend Venezuela's sovereignty and self-determination against U.S. government-led sanctions and attacks. Our website is www.venezuelasolidaritynetwork.org. That's completely spelled out, Venezuela-Solidaritynetwork.org. Sponsoring organizations of the Venezuela Solidarity Network include Alberto Lovera Bolivarian Circle of New York City, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, Alliance for Global Justice, Chicago Alba Solidarity, Code Pink, Fire This Time, Movement for Social Justice of Canada, Friends of the Congo, International Action Center, Just Peace Advocates, Louis Riel Bolivarian Circle of Toronto, Orinoco Tribune, Peace Action Wisconsin, Popular Resistance, Revolutionary Communist Group, Rock Around the Blockade, Sanctions Kill Campaign, Task Force on the Americas, Venezuela Analysis, and the Workers' World Party. And if you're not a member, we encourage you or your organization to get involved. As we'll hear tonight, this is an incredibly critical time for us to be acting in solidarity with Venezuela and doing what we can in North American countries to prevent our governments from taking dangerous action against Venezuela. For today's webinar, we're going to have a panel of 3 excellent speakers, followed by a question and answer period. We're only going to take questions after the speakers have had a chance to speak. So what I would ask is if while they're speaking, if you could try to keep the chat down, that's helpful so folks don't get distracted from what our speakers are saying. If you have questions, there is a Q&A feature which you'll also find at the bottom of your screen. And you can type your questions into there, and then we'll try to address those during the Q&A period. And then let's see, before we get started with our first speaker, we're going to play a video for you. And this is from Tatui TV, and it's about the Embassy Protection Collective struggle, which I was a part of, along with many others who are on this call tonight, and also my partner, the late Kevin Zeese, who was part of that. This is an important overview that looks at kind of the history of attacks on embassies and social movements coming together to protect the embassy in solidarity with Venezuela. So if we could please play that video.
On January 23rd of 2019, as the U.S. government's intervention against Venezuela intensified, and one day after Mike Pence publicly called on a largely unknown member of the National Assembly to proclaim himself president, President Nicolás Maduro announced Venezuela's response.
He decidido romper relaciones diplomáticas y políticas con el gobierno imperialista de los Estados Unidos.
The U.S. government initially refused to recognize this decision, pending what they described as the cessation of usurpation by the head of the Bolivarian government. But when things did not go as they had planned, and on March 13th the United States was compelled to withdraw its entire diplomatic staff from the embassy in Caracas, neither the embassy nor its officials were subject to aggressions or harassment of any kind. The same courtesy was not extended to the Venezuelan embassy in North American territory, which beginning in mid-April experienced an onslaught of attacks and encroachments. Venezuela. Diplomacy under siege. Although the assailing of Venezuelan embassies has become a common tactic to undermine the sovereignty of the Bolivarian nation, we shouldn't forget how the dangerous precedent of diplomatic violations against Venezuela was set in previous years. Cuba, April 12th of 2002. During the attempted coup d'etat and kidnapping of President Hugo Chavez, the Cuban people suffered a deplorable attack on their embassy in Caracas, instigated by the then opposition mayor Enrique Capriles Radonsky.
Esta sede está siendo asediada como nos asedia a nosotros desde hace 40 años Estados Unidos. Y jamás le hemos hecho una concesión a ningún imperio ni a nadie que venga por la fuerza a imponerse a nuestro país.
The besieged Cuban embassy was cut off from water and electricity. Its vehicles were destroyed, and its staff were threatened as a mob of right-wing Cubans and Venezuelans attempted to violently enter the diplomatic headquarters.
Ustedes se van a tener que comer las alfombras, se van a tener que comer las sillas y las mesas que están ahí adentro, porque no les va a entrar comida.
Although the siege of an embassy violates fundamental diplomatic conventions of international law and is as serious as an illegal incursion on an entire nation, this transgression represents nothing new for Venezuela. Let's look back at some recent history. Spain, May 11th of 2017. More than 100 people opposed to the Venezuelan government staged an action at the Venezuelan Center for Cultural Diversity in Madrid, in which the Venezuelan diplomatic staff were subjected to racist and classist insults, harassment, intimidation, and then kidnapping. Ambassador Mario Isea publicly decried this action, denouncing that members of the diplomatic team were violently attacked by the mob. Peru, January 10th of 2019. A group of Venezuelan migrants residing in Lima appeared without warning at the Venezuelan embassy, besieging the staff in a violent protest. This episode took place after Nicolas Maduro was sworn in for his second term, just as the Peruvian government decided not to recognize his authority as part of the interventionist policies of the so-called Lima Group. Cyber attack, February 7th of 2019. The computer networks of the embassies were attacked as well. On this day, the network of websites of the Venezuelan Foreign Ministry suffered attacks that prevented service at the Venezuelan embassies in at least 10 countries. The hackers penetrated the websites of the Venezuelan embassies to publish a fabricated statement in which the diplomatic personnel supposedly recognized the recently self-proclaimed Juan Guaidó, a month after President Nicolas Maduro assumed his legal mandate. Costa Rica, February 20th of 2019. In the early hours of the morning, a fraudulent diplomatic staff chosen by Juan Guaidó took over the facilities of the Venezuelan embassy in Costa Rica by force, violating international law and putting at risk the lives of the officials accredited by the Bolivarian government. They quickly retreated, however, after the Costa Rican Chancellor Manuel Ventura expressed his strong objection. Ecuador, February 20th of 2019. Nearly a dozen people with firearms entered the Venezuelan consulate in the city of Guayaquil. After insulting and humiliating the workers and clients of the diplomatic delegation, they proceeded to steal the consulate's funds. This attack takes place after an eruption of anti-immigrant xenophobia threatened the Venezuelan migrants residing in Ecuador, and in conditions of complete vulnerability due to an absence of police presence in clear violation of Article 22 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which establishes that the receiving state is under a special duty to take all appropriate steps to protect the premises of the mission against any intrusion or damage, and to prevent any disturbance of the peace of the mission or impairment of its dignity. United States, April 16th of 2019. With the rupture of diplomatic relations between Caracas and Washington, the accredited Venezuelan staff were obliged to vacate the embassy, and the government of the United States immediately recognized Voluntad Popular leader Carlos Vecchio as Chargé d'Affaires. By March 18th, Vecchio had already received from a defector 2 offices belonging to Venezuela's defense attaché in the United States, as well as control over the Venezuelan consulate in New York. Everything indicated that the opposition's next step would be to take over the embassy.
Estamos tomando el control de 3 activos de la República. La de la agregaduría que acabamos de ver, militar y naval, el edificio donde estamos actualmente, que preside aquí el coronel Silva Silva. Gracias al coronel Silva Silva, nosotros logramos preservar este edificio y medianamente mantenerlo.
Chile, April 30th of 2019. Opposition protesters lay siege to the Venezuelan embassy in Santiago. The tense calm gives way to a confrontation, after which supporters of Guaidó withdraw and leftist solidarity organizations are brutally repressed by the national police.
Ustedes son fascistas, que queman gente viva, matan gente, porque no piensa igual que ustedes. Fascistas, fuera de Chile los fascistas.
Estamos en la defensa, vamos a poner el cuerpo para defender la revolución bolivariana.
Argentina, April 30th of 2019. A group of right-wing Venezuelans living in Argentina try once again to take the Venezuelan embassy by assault, following several previous attempts. Social organizations in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution, together with a group of patriotic Venezuelans, defended the embassy and stopped its illegal seizure. Unfortunately, the confrontation left 2 people injured and others arrested.
La resistencia nuestra, de este activo y de esta juventud, impidió que esos guachos tomaran 1 centímetro de la embajada. Y aparte obligamos a Macri, que odia al pueblo venezolano, a defender la embajada. Esta es una victoria política, se vea por donde se vea.
The Embassy Protection Collective. The most emblematic of the battles waged around Venezuelan embassies took place in the very heart of the American empire. Days after the seizure of the consulate in New York, in order to prevent Vecchio and his followers from usurping the Venezuelan embassy, a group of 15 American activists from different organizations formed a coalition called the Embassy Protection Collective and entered the embassy building with authorization from the Venezuelan government. The activists held strong, maintaining custody of the building for 37 days, until on March 16th, the last 4 activists who remained guarding the diplomatic headquarters were evicted and arrested. During their defense of the embassy, the building's water and power were illegally cut off, and violent demonstrators, aided by police and Secret Service, prevented the entrance of food and water in an attempt to starve the activists out. Throughout the siege, they were subjected to constant abuse, insults, and physical aggressions by the followers of Guaidó who gathered outside.
Because this doesn't just affect everybody in Venezuela. This is the lifeblood of the United States of America, is disappearing down the drain. This is the start of the brown shirt revolution.
The epic courage of this collective overcame the silence of the corporate media, inspiring the world to take another look at the Venezuelan process, gathering the solidarity of individuals, movements, organizations, and governments in other latitudes. Following their example of solidarity, it will never again be so easy to violate an embassy with impunity.
We're not leaving. We're going to resist. We're going to stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people and the elected government of Venezuela.
We're still here, making it perfectly clear. When the lines are drawn, we're still here.
Solidarity, people, stay strong.
Great, thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that video. So we know that U.S. aggression against Venezuela has been continued under both Democratic and Republican-led regimes, but it was under the Trump administration that the United States took an unprecedented step of attempting a coup, failing, and yet recognizing the U.S. puppet as the president anyway. And that led to a number of other actions that the U.S. took that you'll probably hear about as the U.S. has waged what we call a hybrid war against Venezuela now for several decades. So I'm excited to bring you the speakers tonight so that we can hear about what has been done by the United States, how Venezuelans have resisted these attacks, and what we need to be looking out for under this new Trump administration. We'll begin with our first speaker. I'm honored to introduce FRAVIA Márquez, who is a former Venezuelan diplomat in the United States during the Trump administration, and FRAVIA will offer firsthand insights into the diplomatic challenges and resistance efforts. Thank you, FRAVIA.
Thank you, Margaret. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me today. Watching that documentary was very emotional. I think for all of us, reminded us about things and moments in the past that were very unique and very moving for all the Venezuelan people, but especially those who were in the United States living all these stages and seeing unprecedented, as you call them, actions and situations that we never saw before. In my case, this was when I was in the U.S. In this term. This was my second tour in Washington as a diplomat. I was there first 2006, 2011, and I came back in 2014 when Obama was president. Still, so also with Carlos. And I think we were able to testify the change, the shift of the policy towards Venezuela from the beginning, because let's remember Obama was the one imposing the unilateral coercive measures or sanctions on Venezuela. It started with him. But then after 2017, with Trump administration and everything that started inside Venezuela, thanks to him and the government of the U.S., And in Latin America, even in the European Union, even the behavior inside Congress, the staff of Congress changed. That was very unprecedented because in my case, I used to work with grassroots movements and Congress, being at the embassy. Those were among my responsibilities. And let's say that before that, even though it was not good for Venezuela at all, I would say it was business as usual. They were keeping their political stance, being like respectful, etc. But with Trump, the team of Congress, not only me, we received from the staff, even high-ranking staff like chief of staff at Congress and Senate, like screams, attacks. I remember once with Carlos, he was trying to get his temper back. He never lost it. But the other part was screaming at us, accusing us of human rights abuse and just hitting the table. And we never saw that at Congress because, supposed to be very civil. So it was unprecedented in every little detail. I could say we were able to see. Also, the attacks to Venezuela were unprecedented in all areas, in the economic area, at our embassies, as you already showed. Even we had a diplomat kidnapped. Mr. Alex Saab was kidnapped in Cape Verde during this presidency, and this was recognized by, for instance, Mike Pompeo in a book, because we knew he was a diplomat, he was traveling, we need to take him. We used that little island and we just took it. And we, tortured him, etc., because it was needed. So it was like mask off everyone. And this is what needs to be done, period. We will do it. For me, it was historic. We were living history and international law and international history. And we sometimes couldn't believe that the next step we thought about what's going to happen will happen. And also, when they recognize this puppet regime of Guaido, they bring shame on them, but they also bring shame on the European Union countries, because after that, I have been able, being in Venezuela, working currently, to meet with diplomats from Spain, for instance, who are at the embassy here. And it was very interesting because they, after that, recognized President Maduro. They sent back their ambassadors, most of the countries, not only Spain, but they say, we were able to ask them very politely, of course, what were you thinking? You as diplomat, how do you feel you have to pass through that? And it was a lie. And what kind of policy were you following? The US policy? Are you a sovereign crown, because they are not a democracy, but whatever. Like, it's something that was also, I think, opened the eyes of the other countries in Latin America. Even Nicaragua and Bolivia, I will risk myself to name them, because when we were in Washington, D.C., we also were a witness of what was going on inside OEAs and how they were pointing to Venezuela as the misbehaved country, and why we were leaving the OEAs. And I think at some point, other diplomats in Washington community from other countries, center, right, or left, believed it was because we brought this upon ourselves, because of our model of government, because president, because the speeches, the whatever, Minister of Foreign Affairs. But after this, I'm sure they realize this is a plan. This is not only Venezuela. This was made for all of them. And most of the actions taken against Venezuela, public actions like harassing embassies, harassing diplomats, and kidnapping diplomats, were made with a clear intention to set an example for them. So I will leave it up to there as an opening discussion, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Flavia. And so you mentioned the OAS, the Organization of American States, and that was a really striking thing that this was being done to Venezuela, and the United States could do it to any other country that was a member of the OAS. And it was really, would have been really tremendous for the countries to defend Venezuela, understanding that they were also defending their own possible interests. So next, I'm excited to bring Ron Carlos, who is a former charge d'affaires of Venezuela in the United States. And Ron will also share his experiences as a diplomat and the resistance. Thank you, Ron. Or Carlos, sorry.
Thank you, Margaret, and thank everybody for being here tonight. You know, like you said, I was chargé d'affaires for like right after the Trump administration began. So I spent part of the first Trump administration in the U.S. in Washington, and then about somewhere halfway through, when we had elections here in Venezuela, there was a lot of the typical U.S. Interference in elections, which led President Maduro to take the decision of expelling the chargé d'affaires that was here in Caracas. So right away, I was called back to Caracas and became also deputy minister for North America. So I sort of had the two experiences, one being in Washington, one being in Caracas. And I have to say that, you know, in diplomats' trajectory, you know, the one thing you really don't think you'll get to see or to be part of is actually the breaking of relations, because you know that's like the stream moment. You know, that's the one point where you try not to reach. But it was definitely the best decision, I believe, that was taken by President Maduro, as the Trump administration kept becoming more and more aggressive. And you know, the break of relations in 2019 came accompanied with a whole set of other aggressions and attacks. I mean, we lived in 1 year, you know, almost, you know, all the attacks, like a compact of all the attacks that the U.S. has done in other countries, you know, such as Cuba, you know, countries they've been besieging for a while. You know, it was an economic blockade. Then we had, you know, an attempted invasion by mercenaries. We had, you know, a hacking attack on our electrical system or electrical grid. We had the Department of Justice established bounties, you know, in you know, Wild West style on the head of President Maduro. So it was all a whole set of constant aggression, week after week. You know, that year of 2019, because there was definitely a decision made that, you know, the government was to be overthrown. If anything that, you know, this signals, I believe, the break of the United States with the concept of diplomacy. I think, you know, also of course, you know, the invasion of the embassy and the way it was perpetrated, the way to this day we still don't have access to any of those buildings that were taken over illegally in the United States. It's the example of this idea, of this concept that the United States brought on, you know, in the last several years to the international community, the concept of a rule-based order, where the rules are made by the United States to the convenience of the United States, and where diplomacy or international law, all that is kind of taken aside and left aside. There was a decision made to overthrow the government, and it was a decision that was a priority, and that it didn't matter for the U.S. government if that meant breaking down, any of the concept of diplomacy, the Vienna Convention, and all these other things. So I think ultimately, and as we start to head into the second Trump administration, and we have to think that the problem here is that these are two countries that have specific models or specific ideas of what their purpose of their national purpose is, which are always going to be in contradiction. Unfortunately, for a whole set of reasons, the establishment, the U.S. establishment, has decided for many years ago, and I'm not just saying the Trump administration or the Democratic administrations before that, since even before the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. establishment has said that Latin America is an extension of its territory. It views Latin America as an extension of its territory. And for that reason, it always has sought to have some sort of control, whether it be direct, whether it be by turning presidents, or whether it be economically, whether it be with the influence of NGOs or others actions. But it has definitely sought to have control over this territory. And the processes that have been taken over since the last 200 years in South America are a process of national liberation, anti-colonialism, and the establishment of a republic where we want to rule ourselves and be able to decide our own destiny. Those two ideas are always going to be in counterposition to each other. And I think that's at the end of the day what we need to understand, because we may see, that there are ups and downs, that there are some better moments than others, that there's always some attempts at dialogue. I don't think any president has offered as many attempts to dialogue with the United States as President Maduro has in the last, for more than last two terms that he's had. But the problem is that it never becomes a dialogue where there's mutual recognition and mutual respect, and where there's respect for Venezuelan sovereignty and for Venezuelan freedom and for Venezuela's right to make its own decisions. Of course, when I say this, and I want to emphasize, I'm talking about the U.S. establishment. I'm talking about the apparatus, because if something was very important about the year of 2019, I also think was the display of solidarity on behalf of the U.S. People, the U.S. social movements, the U.S. political activists with regards to Venezuela and in rejection of this policy. And I think that was unprecedented as well. I mean, the defense of the embassy that you, Margaret, and all the other friends carried out was definitely historic. In the middle of this massive attacks, all this, back-to-back aggressions, there were people in the U.S. willing to say, we don't want our country to do this. We don't feel represented by these actions of our country. We believe in peace. We believe in diplomacy. And you took action to do that. And that's something that we in Venezuela are very grateful. And we understand that people of the United States, like the people of Venezuela, are striving towards the same objectives: social justice, freedom, a way to have a better life, a life that we deserve. But there's still within the state concept, within the way the policies were made, there's still that concept of attempt of domination or recolonization in the case of all of Latin America, not just Venezuela. So I like to talk about it because I think it's easy sometimes to think that this is a problem of one specific administration or one specific leader or one specific policy, but this has been the overall policy for the last 200 years. And I could easily trade places right now with someone from Nicaragua, with someone from Cuba, with someone from Panama in '89, with somebody from Guatemala in '54, Chile in '73, and we can have the same conversation because it's still the policy of trying to impose the U.S. Agenda on a region that doesn't feel like, that doesn't have any adversity per se against the United States, but that wants to carry out its own destiny. Well, we'll see. I think it's still early. Of course, the second Trump administration has only been here for about a month, or a little bit after a month. And of course, there's been important interaction. But overall, I think if and when the United States is willing to really come to the table with respect, with the intention of having a win-win type of relationship, I'm sure something could be worked out. But if that's not the case, there's always going to be tension between the U.S. and Latin American countries trying to be free. So start with that.
Thank you so much, Carlos. That was wonderful. And I want to remind folks that we will do a question and answer period after our third speaker. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type your question into there. Please don't put it into the chat because we might miss it there. So our third speaker this evening is Leonardo Flores, and Leo is a analyst and activist with the Venezuela Solidarity Network who specializes in U.S.-Venezuela relations. Leo, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Margaret. So I want to get into a little bit of what we've seen so far from the Trump administration with regards to Venezuela. But before I do, I want to look back a little bit about what we saw with Biden and kind of draw some distinctions. So with the Biden administration, they were negotiating with the Maduro government kind of behind the scenes, generally in the context of dialogue between the Venezuelan opposition and the Venezuelan government. They loosened some oil sanctions in October 2023, only to reimpose them again in April 2024. They did issue some licenses for oil companies like Chevron and a couple of European companies. So on the one hand, they did keep most of these sanctions in place, but it wasn't the same maximum pressure that we saw under Trump. I remember when I was working at the embassy with FRAVIA and with Carlos, we had something called Sanctions Fridays, Viernes Sanciones, because every Friday we'd have a new sanction imposed. Trump imposed 765 sanctions in his first term against Venezuela, and that didn't really happen under Biden. And that's not to say that Biden was significantly better than Trump on Venezuela, because he wasn't. He was just using a different sort of tactic to, again, what Carlos said, is to impose the U.S. will on Venezuela to really further U.S. interests in the region. And of course, the Biden administration kept on blaming the Maduro government for not carrying out the agreements that they had signed. But none of this was actually really true, because throughout this whole time, there were covert U.S. operations going on in Venezuela. So, for example, by December 2023, there was a prisoner exchange, of course, the hostage exchange, rather, because as FRAVIA mentioned, Ambassador Alex Saab, he was traded for U.S. prisoners in Venezuela. And by December 2023, there were no U.S. citizens in prison in Venezuela. But then less than a year later, before Maduro was inaugurated on January 10th of this year, there were now another 13 or so U.S. citizens in jail in Venezuela, all of them linked to kind of mercenary attacks or coup attempts or attempts at terror, basically. So all of this was continuing while the Biden administration was engaged in dialogue with the Maduro government. There was, of course, continued support for Venezuelan fascists who have received something along the lines of $3.5 billion, or just Venezuela funding from USAID and from the State Department over the past 10 years, hit $3.5 billion. And none of that money actually went to help people in Venezuela, although a lot of it was under the guise of so-called humanitarian aid or aid for migrants from Venezuela. Biden also refused to release $3.2 billion in frozen Venezuelan money that would have gone to a UN administered fund to finance health, education, food, security, and electricity. And this was something that was actually agreed to by the government and the Venezuelan opposition. And Biden never came through with that because he knew that any sort of help to the Venezuelan government or to the Venezuelan people would be seen as a victory by the Venezuelan government in the run-up to last summer's presidential elections. So basically, there was a lot of talk, but ultimately, what the Biden administration did was set the stage for the opposition to claim fraud in those elections. And that was basically their plan, was to impose a new Guaidó 2.0, being Edmundo González. And, just real quick, one of the kind of things you hear about Republicans and Democrats in Latin America is that basically that when there's a Republican administration, you kind of expect a kind of a head-on attack, right? But then when the Democrats are in power, you expect them to stab you in the back. And that's kind of what we saw in the difference between the first Trump and the Biden and then the Biden administration. And then with Trump winning again and being inaugurated last month, a lot of us feared a return to this maximum pressure strategy, and so far that hasn't played out. And that hasn't played out, and despite the fact that we have Marco Rubio in the State Department. Marco Rubio, of course, was the architect of the maximum pressure strategy against Latin American countries during the first Trump administration. And it hasn't played out because Trump named this guy named Richard Grenell to be the special envoy for Venezuela and for North Korea. And Richard Grenell kind of represents a more of a MAGA wing that is more isolationist in their foreign policy, or so they claim, whereas Rubio, of course, represents the neocons and the hawks and the kind of the traditional imperialists that we see over the past 25 years or so in the US. But Grenell did something really interesting, is that he went to Venezuela, he met with President Maduro, and as a result of that meeting, there were 6 detained US citizens who came back on a plane with Grenell, and that was a major photo op for the Trump administration, the release of these 6 US prisoners. Some of them one of them was a convicted drug smuggler, another was a hacker, another was a medic. All of them were implicated in some of these attempts at violence that the Biden administration tried to sow in Venezuela between the elections and President Maduro's inauguration. And Grenell said something really interesting last week at CPAC. CPAC is the Conservative Political Action Committee, and they have a yearly conference in Washington, D.C., where it's basically become a who's who of extreme right-wingers in this country. And he did an interview there where he said that, and this is a direct quote, Donald Trump doesn't want to do regime change. And he said, we're not done with Venezuela, we have more to do. And then he went to talk to Venezuela about a different relationship. So that's a really interesting sign. It's promising in some ways, but of course, what one guy in the Trump administration says can be contradicted by someone else in the Trump administration within a couple of days. But so far, it does seem to be holding out that this thesis that there isn't going to be a maximum pressure strategy on Venezuela for now. And that's very promising, of course, because we saw the first time what the sanctions did to Venezuela. Although if they did return, I think Venezuela is in a much better position to withstand them. I mean, the first time around, sanctions led to $630 billion in losses for the Venezuelan economy. Roughly 100,000 people have died because of the collapse of the healthcare system. But now Venezuela has had 3 straight years of economic growth. It's now producing 100% of the food that it consumes. Venezuela is now food sovereign. And it's in a much stronger position right now than it was 6 years ago. And I remember 6 years ago during this Juan Guaido thing, it was actually kind of, I don't want to say easy to build solidarity, but solidarity just was coming to all of us who were working on Venezuela because it was so outlandish what the Trump administration was trying to do and trying to impose this guy who nobody in Venezuela really knew and to just name him the president. And so now there's a kind of a more difficult challenge for the solidarity movement because we don't have that same sort of figure as Guaido. We do have Edmundo Gonzalez, of course, and we have to always emphasize that Edmundo Gonzalez is basically a fascist. He was a Venezuelan diplomat posted in El Salvador in the 1980s when the Venezuelan embassy in San Salvador was used as a logistical hub for the death squadrons that operated in that country. He's been basically a U.S. agent for many years. He is a Zionist, and so is Maria Corina Machado. So these are still dangerous folks, of course. But now, when we're starting to do solidarity work with Venezuela going forward, I think we really should need to focus on what's happening with Venezuelan migrants. Because as you know, Venezuelan migrants have been in the news a lot recently because of what the Trump administration has been doing. So, for example, the Trump administration ended its humanitarian parole program, meaning that there can be no new applicants for this kind of a 2-year visa. And people who are currently in the United States under this parole program face the risk of being deported or have to apply for asylum. The Trump administration also ended TPS for Venezuelans. It's going to affect 600,000 people. And so these people are going to be expected to either go back home or they're going to be deported. And just as a side note, when the Trump administration gave notice of that decision, you had Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said that there were notable improvements in several areas, such as the economy, public health, and crime, that allow for these nationals to be safely returned to their home country. And what we're also seeing, of course, is that Venezuelan migrants are being sent to Guantanamo, including people without criminal records, who are being profiled as being members of the Tren de Aragua cartel just simply for having tattoos. And there's a great article by Michelle Elner of Code Pink, who wrote about this recently. I'll put the link in the chat once I'm done. But it's important that we show solidarity to all these folks because it's really horrible what's happening to them, and they don't have recourse here in the United States because Venezuela doesn't have a consulate here. And so I think that when we talk to our representatives of Venezuela, I think normalizing relations for is going to be incredibly important, and we should push that idea because having a consulate is going to help not just the Venezuelan migrants who are suffering here, but it's going to help U.S. prisoners in Venezuela to have, that security of being able to see diplomats. And over the last month or so, or not even a month, I think 3-4 weeks, we've seen 3 plane loads of returning migrants from Venezuela. I think the first 2 plane loads were people who were basically being shackled as they were put on the plane, and then they arrived in Venezuela free of shackles. One of those planes was from Guantanamo, where 76 Venezuelans were returned from Guantanamo. The U.S. has claimed that all these people are linked to the Tren de Aragua, while Venezuela has confirmed that the vast majority are not. Some of them do have criminal histories, but I don't think that a single person has actually been linked to the cartel yet. And then the most recent plane was a plane load of families that have been returned to Venezuela. So this is really one of the areas of cooperation that we're seeing early on in the stages of the second Trump administration is this issue of migrants. And I think I'm going to leave it there because I've gone over 10 minutes or so, and I want to have some time for Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Leo. So if you have a question, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. You can write your question in there. I'm going to start with the second question excuse me, to you, Leo, from Roger Harris, because you started to kind of address this. But he's wondering if, now that it seems like, or the Trump administration is initially signaling that it's not interested in regime change in Venezuela, do you see this then going into a period of mutual coexistence?
Yeah, I think, well, let me preface that by saying that anything could change very quickly because Trump has always been a guy that acts a bit emotionally, I would say, and reacts, to global events within a way that you can't really predict. So while for now, Grenell has the upper hand, it seems, in terms of his kind of differences between him and Rubio, this could all change next week. So I do for now see this detente happening, and part of it is linked to these tariffs that Trump is threatening on Canada and on Mexico that are set to go in effect next week. These tariffs include 25% energy tariffs for Mexico, 10% for Canada. They got a discount. And what that means is that it makes oil from these countries more expensive relative to oil from Venezuela, meaning that there's a big incentive to keep not just keep the Chevron licenses that have already been issued, but perhaps to expand them and perhaps to start thinking about lifting the oil sanctions. So coexistence for now, yeah, I think that's what we're seeing, and I hope it stays on that track.
Great. Flavia or Carlos, do you want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Well, in my case, okay. Carlos, you want to go? No, okay. So no, in my case, I agree with Leo. I think he mentioned every point on the agenda. And in my opinion, we will see more OFAC licenses coming because of oil. I think they are trying to show themselves kind of pragmatic. It is about the business, and they know they can have war in all fronts. This time, they don't want to be shamed. I think one of the main points for Trump is not to be ashamed, is not to be, since he is a bully, he doesn't want to be bullied by anyone. And last time with Venezuela was a total disaster, not only in the US, not only in the facts, not because I said so or left wing said so, but outside the US, in Europe, what we don't see, going back to diplomatic channels, imagine European Union telling them, okay, we cut ties, we lose money, we lose businesses. What the F? Following your policy, and this was a joke, and they rob your money through USAID. So worse than that, I cannot imagine how worse it could be. Only maybe Milei, but we won't go into Argentina. It's not the topic tonight. But I think he's being more careful. I think I read an article before starting the Trump administration saying what would be the role of Rubio. We all knew Rubio from time ago. I remember when he came into Senate, nobody believed this guy from the news was going to be chosen as a senator. They didn't put a dime on him, and look where he got after. And this article said that probably he will be controlled because he's a secretary of the state. He's part of the executive branch. So you are not on your own as when you are on the legislative branch, and you can bark as much and as high as you want to anyone in any place. So I think that is what is happening to Rubio. But I'm also wondering since the beginning, what was the deal behind this? Because we also know that Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Bolivia, all of us sometimes are like these chips. They can trade among them in their, on the table. I give you this, but I will take that. So I'm still trying to figure it out. What would be the next step on this? That will be all.
Carlos, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think just to complement a bit what our friends have said, the U.S. I think, or the Trump administration has set its priorities very clearly. I think the fact that their foreign policy right now is revolving around two things. First, of course, this tension with China, and second, something that is also a domestic issue, with more than a foreign policy issue, which is the whole hype about migrants and how damaging migrants can be and so forth. So of course they hyped up this notion of dangerous migrants. They decided to use the Tren de Aragua, which of course it's a gang that doesn't exist anymore. There was this bandit here in Venezuela several years ago. None of the people so far that have come, this according to Minister Diosdado Cabello, and that after examining everybody's record, nobody has actual ties to this former gang, but it became something useful that the U.S. can or the Trump administration can exploit in its rhetoric. So of course right now, then the priority becomes dealing with that, doing things that they could show are working for the interest of the people in the US, that sort of rhetoric. And again, the issue with China being that the priority is to keep China away from what it considers, like we said, the historic consideration that Latin America, it's zone of influence. So you have to do things that would keep China away. I think that if the United States now, again, the Trump administration had any notion that the Venezuelan opposition was in any place or in any capacity to take over the government, to reverse the Bolivarian Revolution, to set Venezuela back into the orbit of U.S. influence and doing what the U.S. wants. I don't think the Trump administration would say, "Oh, we're not interested in regime change," or I think that part of the rhetoric has to do with the fact that they realize that the disposition, the opposition here is completely delegitimized. It is not capable of gathering momentum, and it doesn't have, despite all the claims about the elections and so forth, it doesn't have people on the streets. It doesn't have a desire. There's no desire really for the country to have an internal confrontation. And like FRAVIA mentioned, there's this past failure of the previous Trump administration, because they bet all the chips on Guaido and all this parallel government that at the end of the day wasn't able to exist or to carry out its mandate. So I think what you're seeing is the result of priorities. First priority, to give something or to feed into the rhetoric that is doing something to protect the people of the US. And the second, to act in a way that can prevent again the presence of China or other US rivals. And it's not me saying this as a, if there's an article that I think came out today by O'Brien, who's a national security advisor under the first administration, talking about Grinnell's trip here and everything, and then he hits this point where he says, well, it's important for the U.S. to still have control or influence over the oil business in Venezuela, so that companies from China, Russia, Iran don't get involved in the oil business and don't take that away for what they think should be something that belongs to the U.S. I think that is what's driving the current policy, but I'm very convinced that what we're going to see for the next 4 years are probably going to be highs and lows. And if there's any moment where they come to the conclusion again, like they did before, mistakenly, that the opposition would have some room, that there would be somebody in the military willing to turn against the government, that then in any way possible they could take over the government, they would run with that strategy. Again, to me, this is, when you look at the long history of the relations, it's still an attempt of making Venezuela and its resources available for U.S. interests. It's never been about respecting law, or respecting peace, or respecting diplomacy. it's just about how the interests are aligning at this particular moment in time.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it might be important for folks to understand on the call that Venezuela is a deep democracy. I was there in 2020 as an election observer. There are more than 100 parties that were running at that time. There's a longstanding opposition. We met with members of those opposition parties, but they believe strongly in the electoral process in Venezuela. They strongly oppose the U.S. economic coercive measures and the military threats against Venezuela. But then you have this very kind of far right opposition that's U.S. backed and U.S. financed, and so people need to understand there's a whole political spectrum within Venezuela. So I wanted to quickly go to one that was one of the first questions asked, and a very basic one, and one for us in the United States to keep in mind is, what is the political end game of the United States in Venezuela? Why is the U.S. doing this?
I mean, I think the short answer is oil and geopolitical control over the Caribbean basin, and ensuring that kind of broader Latin American integration does not occur.
Anybody want to add to that? I think also we talk about the fact that Venezuela is showing that there are other ways of governing in which people can be involved and in which the resources of a country are used to benefit the people. And I think for folks might want to read some about the history of what Venezuela was like before the Bolivarian Revolution and how it was really just being used, the assets and the wealth being stolen from Venezuela by the wealthy, which I'm sure the U.S. would like to return to that again. Right.
In that sense, Margaret, because Venezuela has been working towards for the last 25 years, the building of multipolarity or pluripolarity, the way we talk about it here, because you need a plurality of poles and of visions. There's an idea or a concept that Venezuela has put forward that we shouldn't have domination, but just one country or one style or one vision. There needs to be different poles with all its possible diversity that sort of balance each other out. This is an idea that's over 200 years old, because it's an idea that was proposed by Simón Bolívar during the movement of independence. He talked about what he called was the equilibrium of the universe, but it was basically that no one country or no one group would be dominant over another, but they could actually meet each other halfway so that there could be peace and harmony throughout the world. And Venezuela has been pushing for that sort of understanding of what the international community should be. That's why Venezuela has been a promoter of integration, regional integration, but also context, the South-South, South America with the African countries, South America with countries in West Asia. Even now, the formation of BRICS that Venezuela has also been very enthusiastic about. So yes, it's oil, and yes, it's a whole wealth of resources. Water is probably going to be a big thing as well. As our climate crisis continues, but it's also, like you said, the example of building another type of international community, international arrangement, and building internally another type of democracy where you have direct participation, where you have where people are showing the world that you can make decisions, you can take decisions at the grassroots level, and that's something that can be transformative. That's something that could be even more democratic that we knew before in our own history. Those examples that Venezuela puts forth are, of course, very, work to undermine U.S. philosophy, U.S. policy, what it has been its policy historically.
Right. So we have a question from John Perry, wondering if there's a prospect of better relations between Venezuela with Brazil and Colombia. And I'm wondering if you could also talk about kind of the role that Colombia has played prior to the Petro government. And I'm wondering if you could add into that, what are the concerns about Ecuador perhaps taking on some of the role that Colombia previously had? So I don't know who wants to start.
I'll
Anybody
let
want
one
to
of the
take that on?
diplomats take that.
FRAVIA?
Well,
Can you? Okay, Carlos. Okay.
no, well, I'll just say, I have to say something about Colombia. You know, it is the first time in 25 years that we've had a government in Colombia that is not openly hostile to the Bolivarian Revolution, and that in itself is something amazing and fabulous because, as you know, we have other neighbors, but the relationship between Venezuela and Colombia, both historically, but also because of the type of border we have, it's been very significant that we don't have a president in Colombia trying to actively participate in the overthrow of the Venezuelan government. Of course, you know, Colombia has its own difficulties. President Petro has his own challenges internally. And you know, we don't have to see eye to eye with the other governments. But I think at the end of the day, you know, and this I have to say, you know, President Maduro has been very, you know, because he was also a diplomat for 6 years under a government or a direction as strong as President Chavez. I think he knows how to handle diplomacy very well, and he has maintained, despite, you know, punctual differences, you know, he has maintained good relations with both countries, and you know, there's a commitment on the part of the Venezuelan government to always try to have the best relationship possible with our neighbors, and I think that is a conviction that this government has, and I think that's something that drives it. Again, sometimes we have differences, and then you see, and a week later we have meetings and we settle them, and that, you know, it's the unfortunate thing that we, you know, that is more difficult to do with a country like the United States or countries like Europe, you know, certain countries in Europe that have also joined the aggression against Venezuela, or even Canada, for that matter. You know, if we talk about North America, you know, in my former position as vice minister, it has been very, very, very difficult to have a relationship on diplomatic terms with Canada. You know, Canada, for example, even forbade Venezuelans to carry out the election of 2018. They didn't allow. It's the only country that didn't allow us to vote in our embassy in somewhere around the world. And like the Venezuelans didn't vote, not because the embassy wasn't open, but because the Canadian government decided that they didn't believe in the election and they weren't going to allow the vote to take place. So that when you see this hostility, whether it be US, Canada, some countries in Europe, you see the difference of how we handled the issues with our own within our own region, and how there's always a conviction, there's always a strive on behalf of the Bolivarian government to dialogue and to come to understandings with our neighbors, and I think that's the most important thing, because that is what really allows for there to be a drive for regional integration and unity.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question, and I'm going to take a question from the Orinoco Tribune, and it also touches on kind of the whole the way that the media has been weaponized against Venezuela, and how that has impacted the strategies and tactics that Venezuela's had to use. But the current issue of Venezuelan migrants, and some of them, after returning to Venezuela, being placed into jail in Venezuela. Orinoco Tribune is saying that that's brought up a lot of questions from its readers about, why is that happening and how is that being used? How's that being weaponized against Venezuela, the issue of migrants returning? Does anybody want to take that one?
Well, I would like to start. I'm sure Leonardo and Carlos can complement whatever I will say, but there are a lot of rumors about what's going on, but that's not true. We have had videos showing on public national television about how migrants, in their majority, have been reunited with their families in Venezuela. They are being greeted live in TV by their mothers, their partners, their couples. But of course, if there are some of them, and this program of come back to Venezuela, Retorno a la Patria, has been going on, I think, for 2 years now, or more than a year. And this didn't get into the news until Trump got into the administration. Because, as you said, they are weaponizing news against Venezuela. What I mean is that they will be sent back, and this started because we have private talks, and this was organized by both governments even before Trump. And Venezuela has a clear record in the Ministry of Justice and all the offices or government offices that are part of this process, registering who and why they are coming back to Venezuela. So those ones that probably could have committed felonies or have crimes, they go through their process. It doesn't mean they are going directly into jail. There is a justice process in Venezuela, like in any other country in the world. So it's not directly like that. But they are trying to build this narrative to link with the Tren de Aragua, as they mentioned also in the question. So that's why they are trying to push it that direction. But it's not that all of them are being in jail. Even more than that, President Maduro has called on different ministers in his cabinet to develop plans to make easier the reincorporation or the coming back to Venezuela of the majority of these people, because most of them, as we have seen in the images on TV, are young men, very few women. So we can see there is a very careful direction in the policies in the US and why they are being sent. Because it's not only men, the ones that are maybe are immigrants, illegal immigrants, or people going to the US. We know there are children that are being separated from their families. We know there are women different ages, not all of them are young, but the ones we're receiving are those. So that is why they are trying to build on this narrative that all of them probably, all these amazing stories that Trump narrated very passionate in their speeches when he was on the campaign about people eating dogs and stuff, all of them Latinos, it doesn't matter if they were Haitians or Venezuelans, etc. So on one side, as Leo mentioned before, this is related to photo ops good for Trump and outcomes that are positive to prove to the people that he delivers. On the other side, is good for the government of Venezuela, because the families here know their people, their loved ones could have been gone to Guantanamo just because of a tattoo, like the link that was published in the chat, or whatever racialized policy or racial profiling. So this is why they are, if you see the details, they look alike. They are driving very carefully the policy, and it's being a public policy for both sides. But in the case of the United States, they are trying to prove, look, this amount of men, all of them men, we told you they are criminals. They came to, rob our works and everything, rape our women, eat our dogs, and whatever he thinks he is saying. So, but it's not true. They are being thrown into jail. I don't know if Leo or Carlos would like to add anything.
Thank you, Flavia. So I'd like to then close the question and answer portion of this webinar and now invite each of the speakers to give a few minutes of closing comments. And Flavia, would you be willing to go first?
Well, thank you. Thank you again for the time. Thank you for this interesting exchange. I think this was an amazing opportunity to go into memory and remember all the amazing historical moments we have survived as people, as diplomats, as Venezuelans, thanks to the support and being amazed by the solidarity of the U.S. people like you, Margaret, your family, all the grassroots movements that are supporting today this webinar. We never thought of this kind of solidarity before, being so personal, so emotional, so full of love, because the only word I can use for what we receive from you all is love, unconditional love. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm sure this will be a long trip with the Trump administration, but we also are ready. We stand ready with our president and our people, with all of our processes to continue and to grow, not only to resist. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavia. Carlos, could you go next, please?
Well, let me also thank everyone for organizing this and always for being there in solidarity with Venezuela in every turn and every opportunity. That is, you won't believe how special, how important that is for us, because we recognize here the importance of U.S., particular U.S. solidarity, being the country where these aggressions have come from. We always cherish that the people of the U.S. Are there to be in solidarity with us. Look, the last idea I want to say is that during all these years, especially during the maximum pressure years, but also the continuation under Biden, we realized that Venezuela can't depend on the U.S. or what policy the U.S. takes in order to craft its future. Venezuela really can only depend on itself. I mean, whatever our future is going to be, whatever our development is going to be, we have to count on what resources we have, and we have to find a way around the hostilities and the aggression. And we've come to terms with that, because at the beginning it was very difficult. I mean, we had some years that were terrible, not only because of the violence of the opposition, but also the problems with food, medicine, shortages that were provoked as part of the blockade. We saw a lot of difficulties, and now we've found ways to be creative. I think that something that we must recognize that happens in Venezuela is that you have this particular joint effort between leadership that is convinced in standing its ground, in doing a different type of government, and in deepening a revolutionary process, and you have an organized community, organized people to back and to implement that. If you don't have the combination of those two things, we can't really have a transformation. And it's that powerful formula that I think has brought us to where we stand. I mean, today we talk to you, of course, with our difficulties and our challenges, but we talk to you from a position of hope, of looking forward, that things are starting to improve. I mean, that is part, one of the reasons that people want to come back to Venezuela right now is because things have changed, and that we have set a different motion. And I think that is our concern now. This year is going to be important. We're going to have transformations where we're going to deepen that democracy. We're going to make it more direct, more. We're rethinking what is the type of democracy that we need for Venezuela. we're working on us. We're working on strengthening this process, on strengthening this model, and we do it with the conviction that we have to, what we're going to achieve is what we put our own efforts in, and we're grateful for the support that you're giving the people of Venezuela, to allow us to to help us make our own decisions, to help our decisions be respected outside in the international community. Because at the end of the day, that's all we need. All we've always needed is that people allow us, people respect our right to make our own decisions and craft our own future.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
To echo the video we saw at the beginning, we're still here. The Solidarity movement is still here, still working hard. The Bolivarian Revolution is still there. And I happen to be from Venezuela, but the reason I, have so much solidarity is because of the revolution, because it's a revolution that is anti-imperialist, that is looking for alternatives to capitalism, that is deeply democratic, as you mentioned, Margaret, as Carlos mentioned as well, and where people's power is not, just a catchphrase. It's actually being put into action. And so I think Venezuela remains this place where incredible things are happening. And, one of the real tragedies of, say, really the past 10 years or so since Obama called Venezuela an extraordinary threat to the United States is that the focus that we used to have was, on seeing all the wonderful things that are going on in Venezuela. And now, unfortunately, the focus is on stopping all the awful things that the United States is trying to do. But I think we can do both those things at the same time. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. And I think really want to show my appreciation to our panelists this evening and to the Venezuela Solidarity Network. As you said, we have a lot of work to continue to do as people, myself living in a country that is an aggressive country towards Venezuela. We have a responsibility to show solidarity and to take action to stop our government from doing these dangerous things. But I also want to remind folks that it's not a one-way thing, the solidarity. It's also returned from Venezuela. And we in North America have so much to learn from Venezuelans. We didn't get to talk about a lot of it tonight, but about the organizing and education that goes on in Venezuela and the amazing resistance. As you talked about, the way that Venezuelans are solving the crises that they've been, inflicted upon them by U.S. aggression and the economic coercive measures. So there's a lot of information for us to exchange between social movements. Venezuela has played a tremendous role in bringing social movements together and organizing. And so that's something that we in North America can be part of. And that's a tremendous experience for folks who have not been able to do that. So I encourage everyone on the webinar tonight, if you're not already a member of Venezuela Solidarity Network, please become a member. And earlier on, there was a link to the Google form where you can do that. But I'm sure we can send out an email to folks who are on the call and give you that information if you would like to have that. I also wanted to just very quickly recognize two people who are attending the call tonight because you'd mentioned the Embassy Protection Collective, and there were, at times there were more than 70 people staying inside of the Venezuelan embassy in Washington, D.C. During that period. There were hundreds of people who were involved. There were thousands of people around the country and people internationally that showed solidarity. That was tremendous. This was not about just a few individuals, but Adrian Pine and David Paul, who are attending this webinar tonight, are two other people who were there when the U.S. government forced its way into the embassy and arrested us. So I wanted to recognize because they continue to show solidarity and take action with Venezuela. So thank you so much to everyone, and we hope that you have a good night. And Viva Venezuela! Let's continue to do this important work because one day we hope that that the U.S. policy will change. We will become a cooperative member of the world and work closely with Venezuela, and we have so much to gain if we can find that day. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret and everyone. Just wanted to say, if people want to stick around, we're going to do a group photo. It's kind of a tradition that we have at the monthly webinars and online actions. So if you want to grab a sign or a t-shirt if you have one, or just raise your fist in the air, you should receive a link that says to accept to join the webinar as a panelist. If you say yes, you'll be able to control your camera and your microphone and join in for photos. So I think probably some folks are kind of pinned. Michelle, if you could help me kind of arrange the screen. I think we'll have some more people joining us here in a second. If you haven't received an invite link and you would like to join us, then go ahead and raise your hand and I make sure that you will get one. I also put into the chat a link for a next webinar, which is March 9th, being organized by a member group of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, the Rock Around the Blockade, and the RCG located in Britain. So there's a link to join that, and hopefully there'll be many more actions announced in solidarity with Venezuela during International Women's Month in March. We can expect there to be, on top of the event of the Venezuela Solidarity Network, which will likely be on March 25th, there should also be more events announced in solidarity with Venezuela at that time. So thank you again, everyone. I think it was a really excellent discussion, and with all of the discussions that take place during the picket actions, it gives us ideas for what to focus on in our next actions. And so that's very helpful. We know what people are looking for, what we should talk about as we continue to build our solidarity with Venezuela in this very important period when recently Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua were all declared so-called enemies of humanity. So we know what the target of the Trump administration is. Okay. So I think we promoted everyone that's going to be promoted. Thank you again all for joining. I have the sign here. Together we say Viva Venezuela, and we will see you all very soon. The big thank you to everyone again, and also to Jose and Giselle, who have been interpreting tonight's action. Viva Venezuela.
Viva
Venezuela.
Venezuela.
Oh, some more people are joining. Hello, hello. Good to see you all. All right. Anyone want the final word? I think we're good to end for tonight. We'll see you at the next action and out in the streets.